So yeah, thank you for coming to watch my talk. I'm going to start off just by sort of echoing Tom's remarks, where there's a lot of people working on like very similar things, and a lot of my talk is going to directly echo actually what he's talked about, and I even make reference to his paper, which is a really great paper, and I encourage people to read it. And yeah, so it's pretty clear there's a lot of sort of work moving from shots to valuing actions and valuing possessions. So my talk's going to come in two parts. For those who missed Karun's excellent talk this morning, I'm going to talk about what expected threat is, the metric that sort of burst onto the scene in his blog post earlier this year, and talk about how we calculate it, and also some of the limitations of expected threat, and like what I propose to sort of overcome some of these. Then I'm going to talk about the results of the model that I introduced, before going on to some applications of this model, and finishing on some future directions. So one of the fundamental problems in quantifying football performance is that it's a really low-scoring game. So in this that infamous Serie A match from last year, Atalanta were held to a 0-0 draw by Empoli. So this might be seen as a disaster by the home team. But over the last 5 years, sort of a lot of work has gone into these abstract metrics of performance, so such as expected goals here. And we can see that Atalanta have actually played quite well here. They've outperformed Empoli 5.1 expected goals to 0.2, and it's only due to maybe like bad finishing. I think this was a really great goalkeeping performance, maybe some bad luck that they didn't end up winning this match. And this allows us to more like accurately rate players and teams over a longer term. But it's clear this isn't the whole story. So for instance, if we use assumed value from Transfermarkt, which is not the best judgment of players, but it's an okay one, we can see that expected goals produced over the last season correlates quite well for attackers, but not so well for defenders and midfielders. I was actually surprised it did at all. There's probably something going on with wide defenders, players like Alexander Zinchenko, who's maybe actually an attacker masquerading as a fullback. And I think this quote from this Opta blog last week really sums up the key tension for researchers in this space. So players who score goals and provide assists are key to any football team, but focus on these two metrics in isolation ignores all other actions on the pitch. So, for example, how are we supposed to properly assess the on-the-ball skills of a defensive midfielder if we disregard 99% of all actions they make? And it's especially relevant given the tagline for StatsBomb, which is quite small up there. But it's every shot, every pass, every shot, every move. And expected goals model only really focuses on the every shot aspect of this. So like Kevin, I'm also an Arsenal fan, so I'm going to be showing lots of videos of Arsenal play this season, if I can get this to play.
What he does very well, he pulls off the back of the centre half, and that's made them...
Can I mute the sound on this? I didn't know there was a thing. I'll just play it for now.
Knowles has the ball on the right-hand side, the Sells goes over, leaves a massive gap, and as the ball comes to Aubameyang, there was never any danger.
So we see here Ainsley Maitland-Niles pick up the ball and play a ball into Aubameyang, who scores the winning goal for Arsenal in their first match of the season. And I want to focus on this moment here in the build-up to the goal. And it's pretty clear that Ainsley Maitland-Niles himself has very little chance of scoring. He's surrounded by 3 defenders and quite a long way out from goal. But I think intuitively as football fans, we can realise there's quite a lot of attacking risk in this picture. There's a free striker just outside the penalty area, and if a ball can find him, then there's a very good chance of a goal being scored. And this is clearly what we want to measure in expected threat. And as Corinne said, there's also similar metrics like expected assists that will pick up similar aspects to this metric. So how do we calculate expected threat? First, we split the pitch into a set of discrete zones. I use 150 8 by 8 meters squared for my modeling. And then we look at the threat generated by holding the ball in each zone. So this is on the first iteration of the model. And this is essentially a modified expected goals model at this point. This is just looking at the chance that a player holding the ball in these zones takes a shot, so the number of shots divided by the total number of actions in the area, and in the probability of them scoring from that shot. So the total number of shots divided by the total number of goals divided by the total number of shots. And the numbers here represent the fractional chance of scoring, if the ball is in the zone on the very next action. But this, if we assume Ainsley Maitland-Niles has the ball somewhere outside the area here, this gives him a 0 expected threat. So what we need to do is iterate backwards and say, what if you don't just take shots? What if you can also move the ball into areas of greater threat? And we do this. I run mine for 5 actions. So this gives the fractional chance of scoring a goal within the next 5 actions on the team. And we can see now that there's a low there's quite a low number here. It's 0.02 roughly. So it says there's like a 1 in 50 chance of him holding the ball here will result in a goal for Arsenal. It might be lower than we'd actually expect, and I'll come on to that at the end of my talk. But at least it's picking up the fact that, Ainsley Maitland-Niles, as a footballer, he's able to pass or dribble the ball towards the goal and lay it off for perhaps someone who's more accomplished at finishing and in a better position to then score. And this is the only equation I'll show, but it basically, it assumes there's two terms here that we need to consider. There's the threat from shots, so this is this first iteration model. The chance of shooting, S, times by the chance of scoring, G, for any zone XY, and then crucially also the threat from movement. So this is the chance of moving the ball from zone XY, and then multiplied by the threat generated from moving the ball from that zone to any other zone, ZW. And then, crucially, also something I'll talk about is the expected threat produced by an action, and this is simply measured as the expected threat at the end of the action. So for Ainsley Maitland-Niles' pass, it's around 0.1, minus the expected threat at the start of that action. So this would be, again, around 0.2 in this, for this example. So then I'm also going to show a quick, so the title's been cut off here, but a quick image video that should sum up one of the things that this model doesn't pick up, which is penalising turnovers. So in this video, the Arsenal midfielder can make a simple pass. He can lay the ball off to a fullback. He can even make an attacking pass like low towards the area, which would generate some expected threat. But instead, he chooses to make this speculative ball into the area. And this will give a greater reward if it's pulled off. This gives a very high chance of scoring, but it also intrinsically carries more risk. By moving this, he's given a good chance that the ball is lost to the opposition. And as Tom mentioned with his vape model, we really want to consider the change in the chance of your own team scoring, but minus the change in the chance of the opposition team scoring. And by giving away the ball here, Arsenal have increased the chance that the opposition will score against them. So, for instance, if we look at the passes made by John Joe Shelby and Tony Kroos last year, my model shows that per 90 minutes, these two produce similar passing expected threat. But we can see that much greater proportion of John Joe Shelby's passes are these long, sort of ranging, like hopeful balls forward, and he's quite good at them. But he's also proportionally losing the ball a lot more than Tony Kroos is. Tony Kroos is much more interested in recycling possession, and we want to penalise this. We want someone who is able to make good passes, but also consistently find the player they're trying to find. And so I have a small change to the expected threat calculation per action in the case of losing the ball. We finished by taking away the starting zone XT. So in this case, the player is losing all that expected threat his team might have built up when he gives away the ball. But it's also, the first term is minus the expected threat for the opposition team retrieving the ball. So this is for zone AB here, where zone AB is a 180-degree rotation of the pitch from the assumed end zone, zone ZW. So for instance, if John Joe Shelby loses the ball in the opposition area, then the team then have to build out from the back. They're going to have a very low expected threat, but they will have some. So my second example, again showing an Arsenal goal.
Watford should clear this, in fact they retreat. Janmaat goes back to Ben Foster, and it's in! Aubameyang!
The flex of Aubameyang and into the goal. And expected threat only really considers attacking threat. It's looking at, what is the chance Arsenal can move the ball forward and score when they're making that attack. It doesn't consider the risk of actually holding the ball, because there is some inherent risk of moving the ball around the pitch. So for instance, passes deep in defence, which carry little chance of immediate goal for the team in possession, are rated as neutral by expected threat. But this doesn't really pass the smell test of what we're all taught as children when we learn to play football, or for instance, not passing across your own area because of the chance of some calamity like this happening. So I make a small adjustment to the model. I introduce a second term to the movement half of the equation, where we have the threat from the movement, but also the risk from moving the ball. The chance of moving the ball times by the risk of losing the ball here, T0, where when you make the pass, this is T1, from XY to zone ZW, and then multiplied by the expected threat of zone AB. So again, this is the rotation of the pitch, because the opposition have to build out from the back, for instance, if you lose the ball upfield. And when we run this through the same Markov model, we get a pitch which shows very similar results in sort of the attacking half, but also shows that there's a negative XT to holding the ball deep in your own half. You really don't, like, moving the ball around out of defense carries some risk. It's actually worse to have the ball in this area than it is to, not have the ball, but there's more chance of the opposition scoring when the defense hold the ball in this area within the next 5 actions. And then finally, we wanted this to be a very holistic model. As I said at the start, we wanted this to include every single action taken by every single player. So I wanted to include shot taking, which the original expected threat model doesn't. So I've got an example from
Mwepu and Huang. A lovely turn, Huang! That's a...
And so when we're including shot taking in the expected threat model, I didn't want to just like use the native XG, because we're really looking at how much extra threat the player adds. And so instead, I wanted to look at their ability to get a good shot off. So I used for this equation the shot XG. Every shot in the StatsBomb database is labeled with an expected goal value, minus the expected threat of just holding the ball in that area. So this is how well is the player able to maximize their XG given the position they're in. And this is going to depend on their ability to find space and get a good angle to goal. So for instance, where the Salzburg player loses his defender here and like opens up a nice clear shot on goal, he's really maximizing his XG. He's contributing a lot of extra threat even as he's just taken the shot. Okay, so then we run this model and we calculated how players generate XT over the season. And we show like a nice distribution of XT generated per 90 from passes and from carries by central attackers, as the original model would show. But we also see a nice heterogeneity in the XT created by wide defenders, and also especially by central defenders, who tend to clump around 0 in the original XT model. And if we look at the top players, so this is something that all football fans are super interested in, which players are the best. You know, we see players we'd expect to see at the top of the XT tables. So for instance, for carries here, we see Frank Ribery, Eden Hazard, Lionel Messi, and Adama Traore, all rated very highly in terms of carries. And if we look at passes, we see players such as Thiago, Marco Verratti, and again, Lionel Messi, who seems to break every attacking metric you throw at him. But we also see players such as Jerome Boateng and Vincent Lorini and Dario Serna, players who are playing more defensively, are still being able to rate by this model because we're looking at how well they're able to carry the ball from risky situations within their defense out towards the opponent's goal and really start the build-up play for a progression. And then also if we look at the top total expected threat generated players, we see again players we expect like Neymar, Mbappe, Salah, James Sancho's on the list. But one thing I want to flag up for later is that, that's the one. We see that actually the modified passing XT seems to be counting against a lot of these players. These have negative values for expected threat generated from passing. And I think it's a limitation of my work, and I'll come back to this at the end of my talk in future directions, but it's just worth bearing in mind at this point. So as I said, I really wanted to consider how well defenders were able to build up play. This is such an important part of the game. We see like Man United spend £80 million on Harry Maguire due to his lauded, carrying and passing ability. And looking at last season's top XT developed by defenders, we see players again we'd expect. Jerome Boateng, Laporte, Alderweireld, David Luiz are all rated very highly by this metric. These are all players that are successfully transitioning the ball from defence upfield. And in contrast, we can look at players who really don't do this well, who are generating negative expected threat for their team because they're either playing risky passes to their teammates or they're just losing the ball. And we see, what's interesting here is we see a lot of first-team Premier League defenders, Shane Duffy, Leon Balogun, Yerry Mina, who might be putting their teams at risk of conceding goals due to the fact that they can't do this progression as well as we might hope. Okay, so I've described the model. I'm now going to go on to 2 quick applications. So the first is if we're scouting, for instance, a replacement player, we might look at pass clustering. We might want to find a player to replace, say, Kieran Trippier for Tottenham, who's involved in build-up play down the wing. So for this, I split the pitch up into 15 zones. These are directly analogous to the 150 zones I mentioned earlier. It's just for a simple PCA, my computer couldn't handle an 150 by 150 matrix. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same. And we're looking at how well players can move the ball from one zone to the other. What is their passing signature? And we do this, and we do a simple k-means clustering on it. This is a very simple algorithm. It was just a quick sort of application. And we get this cluster map, and the color here indicates which positions are overrepresented within each cluster. So for instance, clusters 7 and 8 here, we can see are made up much more of right backs, right wing backs, right side defensive players. So when we're trying to replace a wide defender, we'd look probably within that cluster. But these two players do have different, or these two cluster players do have different passing signatures. I know I said I was right back, by the way. I realized I've flipped the x-axis here, which is why it looks like left back, so I apologize for that. But we can see that the players in cluster 8 are much more involved in directly progressing the ball down the wing into attacking positions, so that then maybe a counter-attacking cross can be put in for a high XG chance. Whereas players in cluster 7 are much more conservative. They're much more involved in spreading the ball maybe across the back line rather than trying to sort of make penetrating passes. And if we look at the total seasonal expected threat generated from passing for players in these two clusters, this also plays out in the data. So players from cluster 8 in blue here show a much wider distribution. The players here which are successful at making these threatening passes forward are either generating a lot of passing XT, or if they're not so successful, they're generating minus XT. Whereas players from cluster 7 are much more middle of the road. They're generally producing 0 expected threat on average. And this is useful because, so for instance, if we clustered players by passing signature, we might then want to say, okay, which is the best passer in cluster 8? We're going to spend however many million to bring him in because this is such an important phase in our attacking play. But that then might only select you players which are sort of out of sample, the players which might be in cluster 8 but only play the safest passes. Whereas here we can look at players which generate the most expected threat, which inherently takes into account the risk of the passes and the reward of the passes. So here, if we're replacing a player in cluster 8, we might want to, for instance, buy Andrea Conti as a right back, who has the highest passing generated expected threat last season. For the second short application, I'm going to show another video of Arsenal playing.
They've started slowly and passing ball at the back like this. You're just taking too much risk.
And you can see how Liverpool are able to successfully press Arsenal and force them to give up a high expected goal chance, which Mane probably should score. And we can see here that if we're using traditional metrics of assessing pressing, we might look at, for instance, again, passing completion rates. But Ceballos here has an easy pass on if he so chooses to make it. But this is really only paying forward the risk. He's then putting this defender in an even worse spot than he's in. And this won't show up in more basic statistics, but expected threat takes into account this. If he does choose to make this pass, it will still show up as a negative expected threat pass. And that he chooses to make a terrible decision. He chooses to pass it basically straight to an oppositional attacker. This really shows up. This is given huge expected threat away to the opposition, even minus the starting expected threat for his team. So then if we look at players' expected threat generated when under pressure, so pressure events are in red here, events not under pressure in blue. For players which are very susceptible to being pressed, we should see this leftward shift. I know this is a very subtle effect here. I struggled for a long time to try and plot these very, very small expected threat events. So it's a log axis where any real change in the distributions here really indicates a significant change in expected threat produced. And we see that Declan Rice here is quite fragile to being pressed. When pressed, he's making bad decisions. He's either giving the ball away or he's just passing the ball backwards, which is then putting his team under more pressure. The goalkeeper maybe clears upfield and the ball's been turned over. And we can plot similarly players who are weak to being pressed. So Makoto Hasebi and Leandro Paredes also show this leftward shift in log passing XT produced over the season per event. And in contrast, we can see players which are resistant to being pressed. So Alexandre Lacazette and Marco Reus show no such left shift when they're pressed. They're able to generate the same amount of threat from passes when being pressed as when they're free to pick out a pass. And if we do a very simple statistical test on this, just looking for the shift in distributions, we can find which players are most fragile to being pressed and which players are most resistant. And what's interesting here is this picks out mainly defensive players who might not be used to having a press forced against them. So for instance, Ben Mee, Declan Weiss, Sean Morrison, all of whom, when pressed, really make much worse decisions. I should mention, actually, this is corrected for the area in the field where they are pressed, so that isn't having an effect. And in contrast, attacking players are much more able to sort of resist the press in general, and especially very highly rated attacking players, Ribéry, Royce, Lorenzo Pellegrini, are all able to generate the same amount of threat from passes when under pressure as when not under pressure. And so this might be useful for teams in preparing tactics. You might be facing, for instance, Ben Mee, and say, okay, as soon as he gets the ball, we're doing a very high, very aggressive press because we know he's probably going to fall apart and give the ball back to us and give us a chance to score. In contrast, if you're setting up against Frank Ribéry, you might say, well, we're not just going to set one defender against him because we know he's very resistant. We might set 2 or 3 players to try and shut him down. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some sort of future directions and some of the limitations of my work. Karun introduced this video of Ajax scoring against PSV in the Super Cup this year. So Van der Beek gets the ball here, passes it over to Dolberg, who then slots it home. And introduced the idea that if we incorporate tracking data, we can look at the zones of control by the attacking team and integrate over this area, integrate the expected threat over this area and see sort of the total threat potential it's labeled here. And we can see that in picture 1 here, there's a very nice organized defense. There's not really that much Ajax can do with the ball here and a low threat potential. But when Van der Beek breaks through and creates this space to be passed into, the threat potential rapidly rises and it results in a goal. And so something I brought up is the fact that I think my model is now penalizing attacking players who try these risky passes a little too much. And the idea I really wanted to get into, but didn't really have the data or the time to look at, was that maybe these players are sort of good passers of the ball. We might expect that Mohamed Salah is a talented football player. He's able to generate threat from passing. But because the turnovers are so costly, he's been over-penalized. And so we might want to instead calculate, kind of facetiously, the expected threat. How much, given the pass that the player makes, how much expected threat might we assume they are able to produce? How close are these players able to get to maximizing the expected threat they can make from options? So it's actually quite hard to find highlights videos of passes that don't result in a chance.
To Xhaka, forward it goes. Aubameyang, space for a shot maybe. Aubameyang tries.
And we can see that Aubameyang makes a good layoff here, but the Liverpool defender is just able to get there and get his foot in and prevent a goal from being scored. In fact, a goal is scored about 5 seconds after this by Arsenal. But given that the ball is in this position, it seems intuitive to everyone who's ever watched a football match. You're screaming at Aubameyang to lay the ball off to Torreira here to get the shot off. And he actually does execute the layoff quite well. And so we might want to take into account, okay, given the options that Aubameyang has he made the best option? Has he executed it quite well? And even if it doesn't come off, maybe we can sort of factor that in as a value to adjust the expected threat lost. And this brings me on to a paper from this year by Javier Fernandez, who spoke earlier today. I didn't get to see it, unfortunately, because it was blocked against Karen's talk, but I'm really interested in looking it up later. But looking at, when you have this tracking data, you can see the value of passes that can be generated across the pitch. And so maybe we can say, okay, a pass out to the wing here, it's very risky, it's going to be very difficult to pull off. But if this player can pull it off, and if this player can even almost pull it off, it might indicate that he's a very, very good passing player. Running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to go on to also my last idea, which is that we might want to look at also expected threat denied. PSV here have a very organized backline of 4 and then 2 players, and Ajax don't really have many options here. Whereas when a player gets sucked out of position here and Van der Beek is left free, you can see this expected threat integration rapidly increases. And this is especially interesting because rating defensive actions is known to be very, very difficult. This is from a StatsBomb blog post from a few years ago, that offenses dictate the game in a way defenses cannot. And for instance, we also have this famous Maldini quote that if you have to make a tackle, you've already made a mistake. So maybe we can look at the expected threat denied instead, and this is giving us a better picture of what defenses are doing in a football match, rather than just running all over the place, trying to make as many tackles and interceptions as possible. Yeah, just to finish off, as Tom said, this is something that really is like ongoing work. So Corinne's original blog post and Ricardo's blog post, which I took the IX score from, came out this year. There's also an Opta blog on a very similar idea from last week, Tom's paper from last year, I think, technically. Or was it this year? And then this Fernandez paper I also from earlier in 2019. And then finally also, I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan, so there's a lot of work on this idea in sort of ice hockey. And then so finally, as Mike said, I'm a final year PhD student, previously worked in biology and some data science work. Relevant to this talk, I'm looking for employment to start next summer, so if you want to find me at the bar later, that would be appreciated. And to thank everyone who's helped me out immensely. And thank you for your time.